Thank you very much, Joe. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Yes, my name is Professor Tim Murithi with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, based in Cape Town. So I think we meet under very solemn conditions, very difficult situation for all the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and also global attention diverted, obviously, due to the multiple global crises, but in particular, I would say the Russian-Ukraine crisis has sucked a lot of energy out of, an international, so-called international community, which we can even question whether it still exists. I mean, I can comment on the historical parallels between the current situation in Palestine, the occupied territories, and the historic situation in South Africa, apartheid South Africa. Then comment a little bit about the Israel's intensive lobbying on the African continent, which Professor, my previous speaker, Afed, mentioned briefly, and then talk about some challenges on the ground and potentially maybe sketch what a renewed global campaign could look like, because that in the end is all that we have, with everything else seemingly paralyzed. And so the historical parallels with South Africa are quite clear. I think South African apartheid system was a very brutal system of racial segregation and institutionalized racism on the basis of white supremacy. And it created a two-tier system, a multiple-tier system, but at least a two-tier system, with restricted movements, what we're seeing today, the checkpoints in the occupied territories, the establishment of restrictions that prevent normal human functioning in effect, going to school, going to a hospital, having access to work, those basic needs that all human beings have, very much alive and well today in 21st century Israel and the occupied territories, and the active role of the Israeli government to actually work behind the scenes to establish military and economic links with countries that it can identify is not new. The South African apartheid system did exactly the same thing with even African governments on the African continent and established military economic links. So this is not a new playbook at all. Israel actively campaigned and eventually received and obtained observer status at the African Union. Palestine has always had a very long-standing, observer status in the African Union, but recently in 2021, Israel achieved the same goal, which created a lot of, kind of brouhaha on the African continent. And it led to heads of state on the African continent, in fact, convening and reviewing this view. It appears that it wasn't a decision that was taken by the member states of the African Union. It was a decision that was taken by the chairperson of the African Union, Musa Faki Mahamat, in July 2021, almost a unilateral decision to grant Israel observer status, and Tel Aviv had been lobbying for almost 20 years. And many African countries actually stood up when they saw this and said, this actually is maybe in contravention with even South Africa's historical struggle with colonialism and occupation, and was not in line with the ethos of the African Union. And it became a real live issue at the level of the heads of state. And it was therefore agreed that the decision would be suspended and that a new committee would deliberate on whether Israel should continue to be accredited. And the specific countries that opposed accreditation were Algeria, Nigeria, and South Africa, while others did support, like Cameroon, Democratic Congo, Rwanda, You've just had that, countries like Sudan are also receiving preferential treatment from Israel. So there is an ongoing diplomatic war, if so to speak. The African Union has issued statements, which in and of themselves are not sufficient, but they can serve as advocacy and lobbying instruments. In the 7th of August, 2022, the chairperson of the African Union, the same chairperson that we're criticizing, she issued a statement that strongly condemned the air attacks by Israel in Gaza that killed more than 30 Palestinians, including 6 children, and called for the usual diplomatic statements about upholding international law and unwavering support of the African Union. That would have been more of a collective statement that came from the wider AU system rather than an individual one. But you see, so we have all this interesting elements happening within across the African continent. In terms of, I think what key elements that some aspects of what we work on at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation are the importance of ensuring and working on maintaining the psychosocial support to the victims and the survivors in the affected communities in the occupied territories. That's easier said than done. I know everyone within that region is within those territories is significantly affected by what is happening. But in South Africa, it was very similar, and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who led the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, often spoke about the need for wounded healers to, in fact, continue to carry the burden of helping their fellow citizens to survive the brutal assault of the apartheid state. And I think in the occupied territories, it has to be a similar approach to addressing these issues. We work also in the field of transitional justice, and in the absence of a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement even, what civil society actors can do is ensure they're actually documenting what's happening. I believe this is already happening in the occupied territories, but also mapping out what transitional justice strategies look like going forward. There was a mention of an international or a global tribunal, but the other options there are a range of options in transitional justice. It shouldn't be exclusively looking at the courts, because particularly one government is oppressive and using brutal force, and has no intention of relinquishing, which was in fact the case in South Africa. Another model is to look at how do you put in place alternative processes of transitional justice, truth documentation of the atrocities, calling upon the perpetrators to come forward and actually acknowledge what they've done and use that as a basis to help the society to move forward. So it sounds harder. It sounds much harder than the way I'm describing it. It did happen in South Africa, and it does not exclude the possibility of happening other parts of the world. And to conclude, I think a renewed global campaign is absolutely necessary, with the eyes of the world diverted in so many different directions. A renewed global campaign that's cross-cutting across different continents, I think, is definitely necessary. And I believe this is what the Arab Organization for Human Rights is currently trying to advocate for and push by also convening us on this platform. So I'll leave it there, Joe, and then we can obviously pick it up in conversation as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, and exactly 10 minutes. And so thanks again. Our next speaker is Sarah Flanders.